very pleased tonight to have Kimberly Dozier from CBS News with us. And Kimberly's presence here is a reminder that witnessing matters. Witnessing takes an incredible kind of bravery that she showed in Iraq, and we are just so grateful that she has made a recovery and is back here with us tonight to talk about the role of journalists in the world. Also, we want to talk to someone who's kind of, you're either poacher turned gamekeeper, I never can get this straight, gamekeeper turned poacher, Steve Cassidy, who works for UNICEF.
I'd like to work for Doctors Without Shirts.
Did work for CNN Online, now working very actively for UNICEF, and we'll talk about UNICEF's role. Marcus Bleasdale, who in a way is one of the people who helped trigger this idea for this discussion, because I saw him on the streets of London, and I said, where are you back from? I'm back from Somalia. He said, which magazine or newspaper were you working for? I said, I wasn't. I'm working there for, I think you were with Médecins Sans Frontières. And he's been many places because of the support of aid groups. And then Stephen Mays, who has seen this over a long time period, 20 years of the World Press Photo Competition, and can talk in a very detailed way about the type of journalism that he has seen and how it's changed and who's doing the journalism. And finally, again, Chris Torgerson, who is with us tonight from Médecins Sans Frontières and has been there for some time. And so she also has seen the incredible development in that organization and also across the humanitarian groups. So great panel. General question, maybe starting with you then, Kimberly. As a working journalist, no one questions that, again, you want to go to these places, but how has it changed in recent time for you in terms of coverage of these areas of the world?
Let's see how this microphone is. It's on. I guess I'm up here because I'm the cautionary tale, and I am the reason that, one of the reasons, together with Bob Woodruff and Doug Vogt and my crew, Paul Douglas and James Brolin, who were killed in the attack that hit the patrol we were with on Memorial Day about 2 years ago. We put the fear into every news editor who sends teams into the field, every corporation, everyone who covers the news, at least on the TV side. I think some people in radio and print had seen these kind of risks before, but there's something about when you got a picture of it and it was your team. My bosses are having a hard time stomaching sending us back into the lion's maw. They're definitely having a hard time thinking about sending me there. After what happened to Bob and Doug and then our team, there was a sort of a retraction. Everyone went back to barracks for a while. We didn't go out on embeds in Iraq or Afghanistan. Something else has happened at the same time. The recession, the news budgets are getting smaller, and also the fact that the American public is getting really sick of seeing news from Iraq and Afghanistan. And we know this by those people who measure the ratings, the minute-by-minute ratings. And when you have a story that comes up from Iraq, I'm told, they change the channel. So those combination of factors mean that news editors think about sending a team on a dangerous mission, and they say, well, what exactly is it going to get me? How much is it going to cost? And therefore, more and more, not all the time, but more and more, they are having to step back from the news break. And that's why we are relying more on aid agencies, people who still go to these places. Now, as a side note, and an important side note, aid agencies are now facing some of the same risks that we journalists are facing in terms of threats from places like, from organizations like Al-Qaeda. So their ability to move around is also being limited. And then the other thing is, I'd like to note, we've always relied on aid agencies for information, as long as I have been a reporter. They get to more places. They are more readily welcomed by the locals. They are bringing things that even an adversarial government needs for their people. So in Belgrade, the Milosevic government didn't want the reporters there, but they needed the aid workers there. So the aid workers were my lifeline for information. And then with that, Steve?
So pick it up from there, Steve, in terms of, Kimberly says, always relied on aid agencies. You spanned back to CNN. Was it the case? Has it changed?
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely true. UNICEF has 200 offices in 190 countries. I thought I was hot spit at CNN when we had 28 international bureaus. UNICEF's got 190 offices. And we've got the phone numbers for people everywhere. I've got colleagues here tonight who've worked out there in the field. I'm not a field guy. But our ability to reach out and connect you or anybody, any other journalist, with people who are actually on the ground, in country, and dealing with real issues is, part of the puzzle. And it's always been part of the puzzle. You talk to people who are on the ground, especially people who maybe understand what is story and understand the complexity of the story. So I agree, always been part of it. The thing that's changed, I think, is that about 7 or 8, maybe 9 years ago, the means of mass communication fell out of the hands of the media elite and fell into the hands of every schmo on the planet. This is one of the thoughts that I have. The starkest example of that are the bad guys in Baghdad. They cut somebody's head off, they videotape the murder, they plug their PD-170 into a G4, the G4 into a satellite phone, they dial into the internet, and at that moment they seize the electronic podium. They're the equal of most of the news agencies on the planet, at least for a couple of seconds. And I was thinking, when I started working at UNICEF, that if the bad guys have figured out how to do that, the good guys ought to have a dog in that fight. They ought to be out there telling their story. There's just so many opportunities today to do that. The technology makes it possible. Through the internet, it's possible. The multiple on-demand reality that we're living in today. I think the journalist's job, having been one and looking at journalism from this perspective now, is to help the world understand this vast amount of information that's flowing in every possible direction, coming from every possible source. So the journalist's job is getting harder and harder and harder because you've got to sort it, you've got to vet it, you've got to put it in context and help the audience, the consumer, understand it. The flow is not going to stop. There's never been a better time to be alive. More information available to more people. Wow, that's fantastic. And the contributions that aid agencies make, I think, is part of that, along with all the other people that are pushing in right now. So that's fine.
Marcus, in a perfect world, would you want to be just going for Newsweek or the Sunday Times Magazine or Stern? Why wouldn't that be the best way to get you to these countries?
No, because then you have to file every night. But no, it's a good question. Slightly different to kind of the experience of the two other speakers that came before. I'm a freelance photographer and I work for whoever will send me. Obviously, as a journalist and as a human being, I have my own concerns and my own work that I like to be doing and concentrating on. And I kind of look at that over the last 10 years, what percentage of that has had some element of either logistical help, finance, from the aid agencies, from either an NGO or from an advocacy unit, then I would say 80%, maybe 85% of the bodies of work that I've produced over the last 10 years have been financed by organizations like Human Rights Watch, MSF, UNICEF, UNHCR, and that's as a freelance photographer. Just one example, in 2003, December 2003, I made calls to maybe 20 magazines and newspapers around the world to say that I wanted to go to this small place in the middle of Africa that no one had ever heard of called Darfur. because there was some really bad stuff going on there. Most people at that stage were concentrating on Iraq and Afghanistan. I made one call to Human Rights Watch, and I had a day rate and expenses covered, and less than 5 days later I was in the field. Newsweek wouldn't send me, Time Magazine wouldn't send me, New York Times wouldn't send me. They were concentrating on other issues. But Human Rights Watch, who had researchers in the field, not just journalists but lawyers, looking and knowing exactly what it is that they should be looking for if they are trying to document human rights abuses. They had the people in the field already, and I was part of a team that went in there and covered what was going on in Darfur when it was starting. So for me, I think 20, 25 years ago, I'm not too sure if that was the case. I think Newsweek and Time Magazine and the New York Times Magazine had the funds to have people in place. How many bureaus do BBC have in Africa now compared to how many bureaus they had 25 years ago? How many bureaus does CNN have compared to how many bureaus they had there 25 years ago? So there's definitely been a shrinking of talent and a network that is on the ground, and that I think has been replaced by people like MSF and people like Human Rights Watch, who are actively they're on the ground 24 hours a day. There's a full-time researcher in Congo for Human Rights Watch, 365 days a year. There certainly isn't someone from CNN there. There isn't somebody from Newsweek there. There isn't somebody from Time Magazine there. But so these guys have, I think, become authorities on countries, and not necessarily just authorities, but then their voice becomes just as politically relevant as a journalist from the New Yorker and an anchor person from CNN. So I think that's kind of the thought that I'd like to bring in there. There is one caveat to all of that. As a result of my close relationship to Human Rights Watch, there are some news agencies that won't work with me, and there are some newspapers that will not take my pictures because of the relationship that I have with Human Rights Watch. And so that's kind of a question that that we should, as news gatherers, think about. Will our relationship, and should our relationship with news gathering agencies be affected because of our relationships with NGOs? And that's kind of a question that we should, I think, answer tonight as well.
Thank you.
Well, I've just been for half a month in Amsterdam working with the World Press Photo, judging their annual competition. And the World Press Photo is a massive competition of photojournalism. I think there were over 4,000, nearly 5,000 photographers submitted work this year from 120 countries from all around the world. And there were 81,000 pictures submitted. And the most shocking thing to me in the whole process, 81,000 pictures is a lot, by the way, in case you need to think about it. The most shocking thing to me was there seems to be an assumed view of the world that photojournalists need to adopt. And it's the same, somehow implicit in the question that we've been asked this evening, that somehow there's an assumption that there's a correct way of viewing the world. And it's an assumption which I find quite worrying and troublesome. And having ploughed through all these pictures, I was just appalled by the narrowness of the vision, that out of these 4,000 to 5,000 photographers, there were so few who were taking an intelligent look at what they were investigating. There were so few who were bringing any kind of innovation or fresh vision to what they were looking at. And it seems to me that there's a certain fear out there of stepping beyond the accepted ways of seeing the world. And I certainly think that's true of the major news channels, but I also think it's an issue with the aid agencies. That having worked on the other end of it, working with photographers who are working with aid agencies, that particular aid agencies have a view of the world which they want put out there. And on the one hand, it offers an opportunity to look into corners, into specialist areas, whether it be water, children, malaria, all the specialist interest groups that are out there in the field, which is on the one hand enriching, and on the other hand, there's a danger of constriction. And certainly, having looked through all these pictures the last month, I was overwhelmed by the narrowness of vision, and I think that behind that there's a certain sort of fear of stepping out of exposing one's own point of view, or of exposing things which one shouldn't be talking about. And one of the questions which I'm interested in looking at this evening is whether the aid agencies, while facilitating access, also in some ways define and restrict the output of journalists in those areas.
That's a very good in-point for you, Chris.
Sure. I hope not, but of course we can't help it at times. Just to start out, that Doctors Without Borders of Médecins Sans Frontières, we use MSF internationally, was actually founded by a group of not only doctors but also journalists. So from the very inception of the organization has had a view that it's not only there to provide a very essential emergency medical care to people in danger and in need, but also to speak out and to bear witness to what our volunteers are seeing on the field. So from the very beginning, in 1971, working with journalists and speaking out about what we're seeing in many places of the world where journalists normally don't go, has been a core part of our work. And so so not much has changed in that sense of working together that I see. But what I wanted to say, and hope we can discuss tonight, is that it's not, from my point of view at MSF, I'm very aware of that danger of bringing in a journalist with us who is a bit too close to us, that relies on us too much. We've been asked, for example, in the last couple of years, particularly after the experiences in Iraq, of can we embed with you and go into Somalia or into Darfur? And we're very reluctant to do that because I feel like, yes, while we are very essentially gathering news about what we do and wanting to get that out to news agencies, we don't want to take over that role. We don't want to be the only source for information for a journalist, for example, because if you really want to tell the story of Darfur, you really want to tell the story of what's happening in Somalia or another place, we hope you're listening to people beyond just the aid agencies. So I think it's an interesting question, but sometimes we know that we're also the main source as being one of the only organizations on the ground that is a source of information for journalists and photojournalists. Just throw that out.
Anyone pick up on anything that's just been said? I mean, the one thing I noticed looking at UNICEF's coverage and also MSF's, was looking at the coverage of Darfur. And there were reports that were on your websites, but I noticed there was never any judgment made about who did what. It was always that the attack took place here. If it was Kenya, it was the violence happened here. So there was no reporting. It was obviously a straightforward discussion about the incidents. But again, we associate journalism with telling us what happened and who made those judgments. And if it's you all,
Hold on a second. We're not doing journalism.
but if that's the only source for a lot of
Let me
people,
just say that right up front. We're not doing journalism. This woman does journalism. This guy does journalism. This guy is a journalist. I used to be a journalist. I'm not now. I'm contributing to the information that's out there. We have a story to tell. And if you were looking at our website, what you saw was repudiation of the violence, repudiation of the injustice, repudiation.
no, these were
of these
descriptive
things.
accounts of what happened, but they weren't accounts that had a judgment about
The
what
judgment,
caused it.
what the judgment is always that we are against that stuff, especially as it impacts children. That's what our mission is. So we're not journalists, and so I beg to differ with you to characterize it that way.
But one of the things that I would say that I have to watch out for is sometimes different aid agencies compete with each other. And they are competing for donor money, they're competing for attention, and every time they get their name out there as opposed to someone else. Now this doesn't always happen with, you become friends with the people who are giving you information. Some of these spokesmen, you're all in the same place without running water, without electricity. Your generator stops working, you run over to their hut, whatever. But you also understand that their boss is yelling at them if you put the UNICEF guy in your piece that was seen by 8 million Americans that night, and you didn't put the MSF person in. I don't know. I'm just using the names. These are not specific people that I've had complaints about, but I have known friends who've had that problem in the field. And I've had friends who are aid spokespeople who've been criticized for they looked too elegant or glamorous, or they weren't cogent enough, or they didn't sound slick enough, because the pressure is on them that in addition to giving us this information, they have to package it in a way that advances their organization. So what I try to do is get in touch with a whole bunch of my friends and see what they're all saying about. In Kosovo, one organization was pushing, yes, there's definitely an outbreak of disease in the camp, cholera, I think they were saying. And another organization was saying no, but got pressure because the first organization was getting their name out with the report. So.
But if you're packaging from London or New York and you'd rather be in the field, you'd rather be at the source, and you're relying on this material, how can you verify? How do you know? Even though it's made available to the agencies insist, if you talk to them, that they label it, but then you talk to other people at places like Eurovision, and they'll say they often see the feeds and it's not labeled properly. How do you know what you're getting, what you're passing along? Are you telling American viewers that this material was provided by MSF or UNICEF or...
Well, you're talking about something different. I'm talking about when I used to be in the field and still the aid workers had more information than I had because they were visiting more camps. And I would gather different accounts from different aid workers from different organizations. Now, if I'm in London and I'm just reaching people on a scratchy satellite phone, first of all, the only time you're often in that situation when the story is big enough to merit a network evening newscast report, it's usually like an earthquake. And information is sketchy all over the place. But there are times, this is why you hear reports where up to 1,000 people may have been killed, and you've got all these qualifiers, and you've got one set of video that's appearing on every single channel, and you're not getting the kaleidoscope that you need for a full picture. You're getting a slice of it, and it might not be an accurate slice.
I mean, at the end of the day, we're journalists, right? So what the aid agencies and what these NGOs, these people on the ground are providing you with is 25% of the story. You're just there as a news gatherer. You're there to collate information from so many different sources, and the aid agencies are a part of that. There's no reason why you should also be getting your political sources, your military sources, on top of the sources that MSF are providing or Human Rights Watch are providing. It's just a part of the pie that makes up the story at the end. And I think it's God forbid that these journalists just rely on one source just because MSF are there and they don't make any other calls. I mean, then that's not a journalist. They shouldn't be doing that story. They shouldn't be in the field. They shouldn't be working for that organization. And I think when we start to rely on these guys wholly, 100% to provide our stories, then, man, just go home and do another job.
But wait, I have a question for you. When we can't get funding to go to Somalia, but we find out some UN organization is going, and they're going to film their whole trip, do you use the video? It might be your only viewpoint out of Somalia, but it's shot by someone else. Do you use it and label it, even though you're kind of giving PR to the organization, but at least you're getting the story out? I mean, that's the kind of decisions we're now having to make. I mean, ignore the story, just don't have Africa at all on the evening news, or reach out to you guys and say, is anyone going in here? Or the last time you went through there, did you get a picture of?
There's a question at the back. Frank, you have a microphone.
Well, look, I'm just kind of interested in the gentleman with the glasses. I forgot your name. Sorry, but you were talking about how. You were talking about how you're not a journalist. You're just working for an aid organization, and you're just presenting information that supports your opposition to whatever it is that you're against, right? But at some point there needs to be some credibility to that communication, right? And so I guess my question is, within journalism, there is an expected level of fact-checking or sourcing in order to verify that there's been appropriate due diligence done so the information has some credibility. But surely the NGOs have to have, internally, they have to have some of their own checks and balances on what they're communicating, because they have something very much at stake, which is their own veracity. So my question to you is, what is your, what standards do you guys hold yourselves to? And are those in any way similar, shape or form, to what journalists hold themselves to?
The way we're working, the answer is yes. The best standards and practices that journalism has to offer, we try to embrace and adhere to those. If we are going to go out and cover a UNICEF team that's going to dig 5 wells and only 3 of them have water and 2 of them are dry, we say 3 of them have water and 2 of them are dry. I think some might think that what we're going to do is say, well, we've had nothing but success. That's not the way we're telling the story, because you're right, the most valuable thing UNICEF or any organization, whether it be journalistic or otherwise, has is its credibility, its believability, its ability to be believed. And so what we've done is embrace and put in place the same sort of checks and balances that exist in the, but it's not journalism. At the end of the day, we do have a point of view. We think that kids ought to be immunized. We think kids ought to get this. We think kids ought to go to school. And so that gives us a point of view which disqualifies us as journalists. Because my understanding when I worked in the field was always that you weren't supposed to have a point of view. You're supposed to sort of seek the unattainable, which was to have it be completely devoid of any point of view. So we're trying to do that. And of course, when this material comes to journalistic organizations and individual reporters, I trust that what they're doing is their job, which is to look at us, vet us, double-check us the same way they would double-check or cross-check any other source that they're working with. It's just that today, in the new reality, we're able to contribute at many different levels. It's no longer just a phone number or just an interview. We're able to send back pictures from these far-flung places. We're able to hook people up with people who are actually on the ground. We're just trying to contribute more than what we've ever contributed before, which I think has been true. 30 years I've been doing this, 35 years. So we're trying to do it that way. Does that answer the question?
I mean, I guess it does, but then on the journalist side, in terms of citing that information, the 3 wells or I've got water and 2 don't. But at some point, where's the line with the journalist with respect to the aid agency, the NGOs? Where's the line of skepticism? Where does it begin to kick in? Is it? I mean, surely there's got to be some of these aid organizations that, for the most part, over years of interfacing with them, where they become solid sources too, where they probably are considered safe bets to take that information and communicate it on, or is it really murkier than that? So I sort of throw that out to the whole audience.
A question, and also please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Minky Warden from Human Rights Watch, and my question is actually directly relevant to our discussion. And I do think it would be useful to point out that there are distinctions between aid organizations and humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations that are essentially trying to change the policy behind a massive ethnic cleansing. And at least speaking for the policy organizations or the advocacy organizations, our objective is to change the policy that is resulting in humanitarian catastrophe in many cases, like Darfur. But more specifically, we use the same tools that journalists use. And just to address Marcus's point that there are a number of venues, media venues, that have some reluctance to use materials that he might have produced, for example, on a Human Rights Watch mission. For example, his photos on Darfur are many of the iconic early images that helped to shape the world public perception of the crisis. So in a situation like that, Human Rights Watch is performing the role that journalists used to perform. We are using exactly the same tools that journalists use, right down to the pens, papers, cameras, video cameras. And it's tragic that we're having to perform this role, but I would hate to contemplate a world where we're not doing that.
Human Rights Watch does take a position. It does come down. It does make a judgment about.
Every time.
If I could just comment on that, because I think I appreciate the comment from Human Rights Watch, and I feel it's important to make that distinction. But it's also important to keep in mind an organization like MSF often, at times, also chooses to take a very strong stand on an issue, and that can be different from sometimes when we're just, because we also have a different role of being an organization that relies very much on private donations worldwide to support the work that we do. So sometimes we feel it's very important that we also need to be accountable to our donors, to the individuals that are supporting us around the world, to get our work out there so people know what they're doing. There are other times where we want to just let the world know that something is happening in a place, like in Darfur in the early days, or in Somalia now, when there isn't enough coverage going on. But then there are times where we choose to take a very strong position, whether it's on access to antiretrovirals in the developing world, which we did very early, whether it's on adoption of newer, better ways to treat malnutrition in children. These are all things that we've chosen to do. And when we do that, we also borrow some tricks from Human Rights Watch and hopefully come up with and use strong epidemiological or medical data that we've gathered. But we still feel that should be questioned by journalists. They should still ask us questions. They should check our figures against others, and we welcome that.
Well, I find this discussion very encouraging, in fact, because I think the whole myth of neutrality is one of the contributing factors to the bland out in this swamp of information that Steve was talking about earlier. There's so much information, but actually so little understanding. And I think that the notion that actually maybe the role of the journalist might actually change to have a point of view, to actually maybe to some extent take an activist position, is actually a very interesting proposition. And I wonder if that's something which either the NGOs would encourage or the journalists would accept.
There's a reason for it. But I think maybe as a photographer, I kind of have a little bit more latitude, but I don't think that I've been and covered a story where I haven't had a point of view. And I challenge anyone to go to Darfur and not have a point of view. I challenge anyone to spend 10 years in Congo and not have a point of view. And, if you want to spend 2 weeks and remain impartial when you discover a mass grave with thousands of bodies in it, well, I don't know anyone in this room that could do that. I certainly can't. And I certainly don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that person who's impartial. I think as a news gatherer, prior to that, I'm a human being, and I have feelings, and I have motivations that I'd quite like the massacres to stop in Darfur, or I'd quite like, the fact that 5.4 million people haven't been killed in Congo in the last 10 years. I would like those statistics not to be the case, but they move me, and they move me to work, and they move me to create the work that I do. And if I didn't have that motivation, and if I didn't have that point of view, then I wouldn't be creating the work I'm creating. And I think it's very important that journalists, at least speaking for myself, I have that need to have a point of view.
But you've got to be there, don't you? I mean, I see Bill Wheatley, who used to run NBC News, was the executive producer of the Nightly News and ran International News Gathering. You've got to have people on the ground to get there to even consider having a point of view, Bill. Don't you? I mean, are you hearing a lot of sort of pretty much consensus here, or are we missing some fundamental issues here about the role of donor groups?
A couple of comments. I think that it's absolutely good that the aid agencies are out there gathering information that can be very helpful to journalists, and not only do journalists don't always change the world, politicians sometimes do, and they certainly use that information. And just like any other story to which journalists are assigned, you have to sift through the information, understand what, if any, prejudice the person giving it to you might have. If it's the pictures that they're giving you, I think you're under some special obligation to clearly identify them. By that, I don't mean a little cut line underneath a photo in the New York Times, or a very fast super that goes up over it on the network evening news. I think in the narration itself of the piece, you have to say these pictures were provided by Human Rights Watch and sort of define Human Rights Watch. So you have context for them. I think one of the underlying questions here, though, that we're all thinking about is why isn't there more coverage? And I think that Kimberly began discussing that, and there's a lot of reasons, I think, for that. One of the tough things as someone who used to do the evening news in terms of producing it, and I did it more in the Cold War era, is that there's just so much going on in this world today to cover. And even a horror like Darfur, the Congo, is one of many things to which you can turn your attention. And while I heard, John, your description of some of those stories that were in the top 15, the Britney Spears, Paris Hilton stuff, that's not on the network evening newscast, so very, very rarely. So it's not that they're competing in that, but they're competing with Iraq, they're competing with Afghanistan, they're competing with the American election, they're competing with health news, they're competing with an increasing amount of coverage on the environment and all. But you're right, the way you started the question here, you do have to be there to do a good job. I know someone like Kimberly, she's an excellent journalist, and if she's there, she's going to do a very good job, and she's not going to be anybody's fool. She's not going to just take the word of one agency, or she's going to weigh it all based on her experience, based on the questions that she's asking. I also know, by the way, that she's in London to package this stuff. She's going to be as aggressive as she possibly can be to get to the truth even from London. It's not the same thing, clearly. The other thing is that the challenge, I think, for the networks, and I'll shut up, but the challenge for the networks is that we tell stories. We don't just put information in there, we tell stories. And that's the challenge for all journalists, is to tell a story that gets the interest of the public. And it's not our job necessarily to cause social change. It is our job to report on what's going on. And if we tell stories properly, we'll do a lot better. NBC just did a series of stories from Congo in the last 10 days or so, night after night. Each of them was a carefully crafted story about an aspect of Congo. And I think they cut through in a way far better than sort of a gazetteer approach of just, a lot of factual information. So the only way you really do a good job telling a story, I'm sure Kimberly will back me up on this, is to be there.
That required the President of the United States to go to Africa for a pay.
No. That was a separate assignment. While she was there, she interviewed him, but the stories were separate from his involvement.
Andrew was right next to you. Want to say something and then the daily.
Yeah, the Congo stories were by Anne Curry, who's also done a lot of work on Darfur as well. She's on the Today Show normally, but she appears specifically on humanitarian stories on the nightly news. And in Congo, she was at the UNICEF camps, and most of her stories were based clearly through the prism of UNICEF. So let me jump off from that to talk about these stories, but then in general to respond to what Bill just said, because I think I think we should emphasize the flip side of what he was saying about let's not do gazetteers, but let's do stories. Because I think, you weren't very specific about what your complaint was about the bland out of humanitarian journalism. My personal perception, having seen a lot of this type of coverage, well, as much as there is, on the evening newscasts in the United States, is that the injunction that goes out from the executive producers to say you have to come back with a story is the response to that, the cliched response to that, is to give stories of victimization, archly sentimental stories, ones that don't actually talk about what's going on, what the political forces are that are at play, but find a brutalized 15-year-old girl, and you're going to have 4 minutes on that, and it's going to make you cry. And it's very, very manipulative journalism, very sentimental journalism, one that emphasizes all of the people in these places are in the mode of victims, and the only response we can have to them is to help them, and implicitly by donating money to the aid organizations that are fundraising by using these pictures. So I don't know if that's what you meant by the blandness of the journalism, but that's certainly my perception, that there's far too much sentimentality in these humanitarian coverage. And I think that comes from the top by saying, you've got to have a story here, which means you've got to have your heartstrings being pulled.
I just respond to my old friend Andrew, who's been reporting on my work for years. Yes, it's important to have the context for the stories that you tell, but I think in terms of, for those of you in the audience who are worrying about or thinking about how does this lead to anything good happening, the sentimentality, as Andrew calls it, I guess I wouldn't exactly use that word, I call it real life circumstances, is the sort of thing that certainly heretofore, and I don't know any reason why it would be changing, has made a big difference. I think back to the BBC stories from Ethiopia in the early 80s and late 70s, and how they galvanized a world aid effort to help the Ethiopians. And they all used characters in their stories. They weren't just a recitation of fact.
Hold on. To his Ethiopia, George Bush was in the White House and watched CNN and saw the horrible stories from Somalia, and he put the Marines into Mogadishu without a plan or a policy or an understanding of the politics, because his heartstrings got tugged, and they were in there for whatever it was, 18 months or 2 years, and then Black Hawk down, and they went out, and the whole thing was a sentimental response to their heartstrings being pulled, rather than a geopolitical response to an actual political crisis on the ground.
Last word.
We can't be responsible for what George Bush does.
No, I just have a few possibly unrelated comments to make. That I see a lot of strands coming together, perhaps because I was a journalist for a long time before I went to Human Rights Watch. In answer to an earlier question, we will shortly be updating our methodology section, so we will actually have a kind of comprehensive sort of code of ethics and work, so that you can actually go and see how it is that we gather information and what sort of safeguards, we work around. But I think that what we all, as journalists especially, should bear in mind is why NGOs have, gone along this path. And, we do it for many reasons. In our case, it's a little bit different. We're not, because we're a human rights organization, what we're pushing is information. And in the past, we do sort of book-length reports, and from the field, one would go and find the researcher, and they'd, give you some information about what they've been finding. Now in the world of the internet and images, we can't just put out, 150 pages of text, because, even policymakers aren't actually going to read all that, or a lot of them aren't. So we find ourselves looking for ways to package our information differently. And this is why, somebody like Marcus is just an incredible partner, because he finds, a way to document what we're doing in a different way that is possibly more compelling and more attractive and draws people into the story. We are also, often we're just trying to get the issue out. Sometimes we're trying to get ourselves into the news, and it's nice to have our name. But other times, we're just trying to provide material that will encourage, journalists to follow a story. We have multiple sort of motives when we get, when we start to work with journalists. I think that our relationship is slightly different because, the product we're pushing ultimately is information, and we were talking about credibility and reputation, and of course that's absolutely key. And since that's all we have to offer, we have to try to make sure that it's as reliable as possible. And we apply those same rules to the photography and the video and the audio that we provide, which is why we work with, seasoned and extremely respected professionals.
Could I say, you do sound like one of us? Interesting. Okay, how do we get the eyeballs to stay on the screen? Compelling pictures, a character, someone that you care about. I came across an interesting survey, bit of research that I think explains a lot of what we go through. yes, I get, just like what Andrew was talking about, the sentimentality. I call it schmaltz. I hate when they want me to make it, the whole, oh yeah, close up on the eyes and the tear. Oh, I don't want to do that. But the fact of the matter is, this piece of research had a group of people donate to kids. They could donate to one child, and they got a little history, or 2, or 4, or 10. And sure enough, the single child got the most money, because apparently people can relate to one person, an individual. Once it becomes, when you say it's this one child has lost her mother in this refugee camp, people are, when you say these 300 children have lost their parents in this refugee camp, people are switching the channel. So I try to think of it, have any of y'all read that, I started as a print journalist, and the articles that you are taught to worship it's the center column of the Wall Street Journal, and it's done as a pyramid and then a reverse pyramid. You start with the individual. It builds out to the information that you feel like you're trying to funnel into down their gullet, and then you go back to the individual. But so you got to sucker them in with that story, that person they can relate to, and then, by the way, this is happening to a bunch of people. You should do something about it. You should care. Okay, and back to this person who, in this case, either lost their livelihood or there was a happy ending.
But to Andrew's point, I mean, not all of these conflicts lend themselves to a narrative that can be easily told that way. If you were picking up on Nicholas Kristof today and trying to tell the background to why the north and south of Sudan have come undone, how could and you went into a story meeting and proposed that.
And I literally can't sell it. It's sometimes I talk about selling a story, and I never used to, because I came from the human rights field, and so I hear myself and say, I'm talking about the best picture, the best shot, a character who's appealing. Oh, I hate myself. But I also know what's going to make people keep watching. And if that's what I've got to do to make them care, okay, I'll find that person. If I get the funding and if I get to get on the plane to get there. So.
I just want to go back to one point that we made earlier on, is that, just to kind of define how, because I think there's a lot of people, we're talking about lots of different media sources here, and everyone works very differently when they're on the ground. But as a freelance photographer, I don't do anything different when I'm working for Time Magazine or when I'm working for Human Rights Watch. The only difference is that the person that pays for the fuel and the truck that I'm driving is an advocacy group and not a magazine. I do the same job, I don't have any agenda. I'm looking to tell the story visually, and whether Human Rights Watch is paying.
But you did just say that you eventually care so much that eventually you do have an agenda.
Yeah, but I don't. It's not Human Rights Watch's agenda. It's me as a human being. I'm sorry, but someone's 2,000 people are dead in a village. I feel quite passionate about that, and I want people to know about it. Whether Human Rights Watch used that on front of a report or it runs as a double-page spread in Time Magazine doesn't make any difference to me.
You're accomplishing the same goal because you're getting the picture out.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just kind of wanted to make that definition between. I think some people think that if you're working for Human Rights Watch, you're kind of driving around in this car with, flags flying and the side of the car stamped Human Rights Watch, and people are kind of doing a runner or either running at you to tell their story. That's not like that at all. I'm just I'm either on a motorbike or on a run, in a 4x4, just driving down the road like I would be if I was working for Time Magazine. No difference.
I just wanted to comment on what I think is what was just discussed a little bit of what the real problem and what the change has been in the last 10 years that I've been working with MSF is this much smaller number of journalists who can be on the ground there all the time, the people that we can talk to and tell our stories to, that has dramatically reduced and that will really understand because they've been covering whether it's a conflict or a country for a number of years, and they really know that, and they can produce, yes, what you call the schmaltz piece, but they can also produce other pieces because they have that ability, because they stay on the ground and they can follow a story. And then that's what we really see as a difference. Therefore, because we have fewer people we can talk to about that, I know that I make choices at some certain times of like, should I send the press release about cholera to the same cholera in the Congo to the same journalist at the New York Times who I know is also this week covering the situation in Somalia? I know they won't pay attention, and there's not that many other people that I can talk to about what's happening in another country. And therefore, you really see that there is a narrowing of the space for really sustained coverage of crises that we're seeing. And that's why then we do turn to other methods of getting our story out, as Human Rights Watch and other organizations do very differently. We're an operational organization, so we also make choices for basis of security issues, etc. But then we have been using new means, whether it's making our own podcast or coming up with videos that we can put on YouTube. They're always clearly labeled. People know they're from us. Using Marcus's photos and excellent photo essays that we put out. But we hope that there are still people who want to know what's happening in these places and want a more nuanced view. So yes, we are producing different types of materials because of that.
Zach, this is the guy, Laban. Following on what the gentleman to the right of me said, I also was sort of curious about the nature of the blandness and the narrowness of the images that you said that you had viewed. And more generally, my question is, I'm trying to get an idea of the way that the agenda of, I guess, a aid group would be detrimental to the more objective version of the events getting out there. Like, is there, I guess, a more concrete example?
Anybody want to view that?
It might be a question for Kimberly too. The second part, I guess.
Yeah, can you expand on your question?
As a reader, how would the agenda that an aid group have be detrimental to a more objective version of the story getting out there? Like, what's an example? How would that hurt?
If the aid group provides overly empathetic coverage,
for instance,
of some situation that deserves a harder-edged reporting on the underlying causes,
sure,
something like that.
Well, if I could answer that, I mean, if, for example, and sometimes we do choose to do this, is to help facilitate journalists get into places that are very difficult for them to get access to. But we usually are even reluctant to do that when we have to be exclusively the only means of transportation, the only means of access that a journalist has to get to a place. Because we know then, there's no question that, we're happy when we get our name check on the evening news, but we also know, well, they're not necessarily getting the full story because they're coming with us. They are many times, if you're with MSF, you are in a car with a flag up and the logo is on the side, and that may be necessary at certain points. But I think it's important, and I know most of the journalists that do that, they also are aware of that. But I think it can still narrow the view, and it's sometimes just necessary.
I quite often don't have enough money from Newsweek or Time Magazine to cover a story, and I need to go to MSF or Human Rights Watch to financially make this a viable trip. Otherwise, I'll constantly lose money. And freelance photographers and freelance journalists are constantly thinking this way to use organisations like Human Rights Watch, MSF, UNICEF to be a partial funding of a job that can cover two sides to it. You can work for MSF and you can work for Le Monde or Time Magazine.
Daniel Pimlow. I just wondered, isn't there a pressure on you as a journalist if you're being paid by an aid agency to provide a product that they're happy with? Isn't that a threat to your journalism? And at the same time, from the other side, I mean, if you were helping or you were paying for a journalist to take pictures or report on a situation, would you be prepared to keep on paying for them even if they weren't providing the kind of service or the kind of coverage that you actually wanted?
Do you want to answer the first bit and you answer the second bit, or whatever? I mean, I'm being paid by the response that I gave earlier. I don't behave in any different way. They don't pay me to provide them imagery that they're satisfied with. They pay me to provide imagery that they think I'm skillful enough to hopefully obtain and get myself to a place where I can provide them with that image. I don't care whether they're happy with it or not. You know, the main definition of who's happy here or not is me. You know, I'm the journalist. If MSF is unhappy with the images, I'm sorry, but you know. What?
Maybe not next time, but what always happens.
Oh, well, I mean, maybe they don't use me next time if I hand them 50 images that they feel that they can't use. But hopefully they're paying me because I'm a journalist who has proved in the past that you have a certain skill, you can get that image, you can get to that place, you can achieve a certain body of work, and that's what they're paying for. They're not paying me to represent a defined opinion that it's MSF's or Human Rights Watch's opinion. It's my opinion, and that's what they're paying me for.
I just want to make it clear so that it doesn't seem as if organizations like MSF and others are rampantly paying journalists or photographers to go to do reporting on ours. It's just not the case. In most cases, we are, in fact, working together with a photojournalist who has an assignment or who has a personal project. We help facilitate them on the ground in exchange for some photographs that we can use for our own materials. That's the standard case with us. And there's endless debate within our organization about whether how much should we facilitate a journalist? Should we be paying photographers? Well, yes, we need pictures and we want the top quality, so of course we're going to hire a top quality photographer who's willing to go to the places we go to. But then there are the questions that we sometimes have. Should we allow a journalist in our car going to visit a place? And we also have security considerations to take into account as well.
What I would raise is, well, look what happens to us when you have a journalist in a car with aid workers. The two of you get labeled as the same thing. We were embedded with the U.S. military. We got labeled as a legitimate target, and it's hard to argue with that. If we were with insurgents, we would also be a legitimate target for their adversaries. Marcus is lucky you found, as a freelancer, a place to work for that matches the reasons you do the job and needs the same product that you would be producing anyway. I found some of this debate that we've had is a little mind-bending, considering that